Very lucky to be joined in studio today by Dr. Sheline, who not only resigned from the State Department, which we'll discuss, but now has landed back at the Quincy Institute as a research fellow for the Middle East. So great to meet you in person. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so first just set up who you are a little bit, your time at the State Department, and what was the reason that you ultimately decided you needed to resign and to do so publicly as well.
Yeah, so I was at the State Department's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, so focusing on human rights in their Office of Near Eastern Affairs, so the acronym is DRL-NEA. And I had only been there a year when I resigned and decided to do so publicly over the Biden administration's unconditional support for Israel's military operations in Gaza. And I had support in that. Part of the reason I decided to go public, despite the fact that I was quite junior. You know, at first I thought, who am I to go public? I've only just gotten here. And it was because colleagues said, please reconsider, go public, speak for us. We can't resign or we can't do so publicly. And it seemed at the time that that the only thing that was contributing to any kind of shift was this public pressure, like we saw with the Uncommitted campaign. So I decided I would go public, and I think at the time only Josh Paul had resigned, who resigned almost immediately after October 7th, and then Tara Kabash, who'd resigned from the Department of Education. And then after I resigned, we have seen more people resign, which is encouraging, because I do think people are really starting to get to the limit of what they are willing to be complicit in.
Do you know of other resignations that happened that weren't public? Because Kyle and I were actually discussing this, that it does seem like after you resigned, there has been a bit of an uptick, but it's still a relatively small number.
It is small, unfortunately. And there are certainly people who've resigned quietly or who have decided to retire maybe earlier than they might have otherwise done so. And I can understand that, especially for someone who spent their entire career in government, this is their whole professional network, to burn those bridges is really scary. And this is kind of a one-company town. And so if you can't work for the government and that's all that you've ever known, I get it. And, it's a reality in this country without income, without health insurance, there's no safety net. It's really scary. Whereas I was very privileged that I had an academic background. I had come from the think tank sector and now was able to go back to the same think tank, which I was very grateful to be able to do. And so, I understand why for many people it's just not possible.
So I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think there were like maybe 5 very public resignations, not just at the State Department, but like in various parts of the government. How many would you say, if you had to guess, how many secretly are sort of whispering to each other like, this is crazy, like, what are we doing here? I don't like this.
I mean, it's really hard to say. I mean, the government is huge. The State Department is huge, has thousands of employees. But right from the beginning, as it became clear kind of the statements of genocidal intent that we were hearing, when Josh resigned, it was, I think, 11 days after October 7th. But already by that time, we'd seen the total siege imposed. I mean, there was already the blockade of Gaza, but, these videos of people with no water and, no food and no electricity, quite soon afterwards, we were hearing statements from Israeli government officials making very clear what their intention was. And so I think for me inside the State Department, as well as colleagues, there was concern very early on about what it was that the U.S. was going to be supporting here, which is why Josh resigned so quickly, because he saw that these munitions were being rushed to Israel. Already Israel gets special treatment, unlike any other country as far as not only the amount of money that they get, the kind of weapons they get, but just the ways that they are not subject to the same constraints that other countries are. And so he saw even whatever minimal constraint was being thrown out the window, which is why he said, I cannot sign off on these anymore. But this question has come up a lot of like, how widespread is the dissent? I do think it is relatively widespread, but it's really hard to put a number on it. I do think as time goes on and we continue to see just this failed belief from the Biden administration that the Bibi government is actually interested in a ceasefire, and just continually it is clear that that does not serve his political interests. I think people are really reaching their breaking point.
Because I know I saw this, Crystal. Did you see this? Like among White House staffers, there's apparently been a lot of issues where they even joined some of the protests that were happening outside of the White House. Do you remember that?
Yeah, we've seen a good number of anonymous letters from White House staffers or, other government workers. But to your point, it's no easy thing to publicly resign and know you're going to be persona non grata in this town forever. One thing I wanted to ask you about was, can you elaborate more on the Israel special treatment? And is it Israel specifically, or is it any U.S. ally? Like
Saudi Arabia as well.
Yeah. What does that look like internally?
It is particular to Israel. So for example, I had been working more on Yemen, and we did see when the Biden administration came in, they reversed a lot of the Trump policies and said that the U.S. was no longer going to send offensive weapons to Saudi Arabia. There's, that is...
Big loophole.
Right.
Offensive weapons.
Right. The definition of an offensive
that one's
weapon.
defensive.
This
Don't worry
bomb
about
is
it.
defensive.
Exactly. I mean, it's very hard to define, but it was, clearly stated. And there were certain things that the Saudis wanted that the U.S. did not send them. I think at this point, obviously, things have shifted there. But it was just a clear example of the Biden administration saying, even though we very much value the relationship with Saudi Arabia, we are going to try to limit what they've been doing in Yemen. And I use that to illustrate that none of this has been done with Israel, despite the horrible things, horrifying things that we're seeing. Just zero efforts to try to pressure the Israeli government. So, some of it is written into law, like your questions about what is particular about Israel. I mean, some of it is like the qualitative military advantage.
Right.
We've also seen some concerning amendments that have made their way into the NDAA, which is being discussed now. Things like not permitting funds to be used to reconstruct Gaza, for example, which is really horrifying.
There sure is.
This is not in the NDA. This was already decided previously, but, like the defunding of UNRWA, which is a UN agency to provide support for Palestinian refugees after Israel made these allegations about 12 employees that allegedly had Hamas ties that they have not backed up.
Right.
And this has devastating consequences, not only for Gaza, but also for the West Bank. I mean, this was the UN agency responsible for the well-being of Palestinians that had functioned for decades to try to help this population continue to survive. So it's really shocking what we've seen Congress do here, and although we have a few brave members of Congress speaking out about this, I mean, the Israel lobby is extremely powerful. And thus far, we have not seen a political movement emerging to try to push back against it, to say that it is completely against American values to have the interests of a foreign country dictate how our lawmakers vote, and essentially so much of our foreign policy in the Middle East is about what does Israel want? What does the Israel lobby want?
Yeah, I just saw a report. You probably saw this too, Kyle. That AIPAC's affiliated PAC, the United Democracy Project, is the largest dark money spender in all Democratic primaries. I mean, just think about that. And by the way, they're funded by a bunch of Republicans. So it's like, these large Republican donors backing the interest of not even a foreign government at this point, but specifically Bibi Netanyahu, because I would argue, and I know you argue as well, what Israel's doing isn't even in Israel's interest at this point.
Exactly.
Is the number one political player in Democratic primaries. It's preposterous state of affairs.
Right. Well, and even Hillary Clinton coming out and supporting Lattimore against Jamal Bowman.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, so it's not even just a question of, dark Republican money. I mean, it's, AIPAC gives to Dems and Republicans and, across the board. And thus far, it's just really difficult. Our political system is so captured by moneyed interests, and without that, it's thus far been impossible to try to push back against their power.
What's the response among your colleagues when you were there, when Biden comes out and says, okay, you know what, we're not going to send Israel 2,000-pound bombs anymore, and then they reverse that not even a week later? Or, you know what, we're going to do sanctions on these illegal settlers in the West Bank, and then when nobody's looking, doesn't do that either, reverses that. Is there a sense internally that the reaction is similar to what it's like for us externally, where we're like, who does he think he's kidding? We could see all these things, and this is ridiculous.
I mean, it is definitely a political issue. And, to your question about how do people react, it really depends. So, the office I was sitting in works on human rights, works closely with the Security and Human Rights Office, SHR, which is responsible for things like sanctions. So, a whole team of people had worked extremely hard on finding, who would, again, sort of just the very tip of the iceberg as far as sanctioning some of these extremist settlers. It was just a handful of individuals.
Like 4 people or something.
Exactly.
It was the worst of the worst, yeah.
Exactly. And that that this office worked so hard to even make that happen, that was seen as a win. And then it's reversed because it's just politically, and this was something that certainly came up in other work that our office was doing, was that it was always just a question of political will, which speaks to the broader issue. Like, there are laws here. There are the Leahy laws. There's Section 620I of the Foreign Assistance Act, which would stipulate that because Israel is blocking American humanitarian aid, they are no longer eligible to receive security assistance. End of story. And the NSM-20 was supposed to say that unequivocally. And people like Stacey Gilbert, who resigned, who were working directly on the NSM-20, said that is what it had said. And then they were taken off of it.
And that report, just so people remember, that's the one that Congress basically pressured the State Department into preparing this report. They used actual experts in the original preparation. And then basically the, more senior people came in over the top to cook the books, is effectively what happened, correct?
Exactly.
I wanted to ask you too, this isn't so much a State Department question, but I think part of what has made this all extra, it's just added an extra layer of hypocrisy and outrage, is that we've had the Biden administration using the language of human rights to talk so much about Russia's invasion of Ukraine and to justify that to the American people why we should be continuing to support the Ukrainians and send, significant dollars and weapons and support their way. This was all about democracy and standing up for human rights, and Putin's committing a genocide and he's committing war crimes. And, they knew what those words meant in the context of that war. And then suddenly when you hear Matt Miller or John Kirby or any of the other ones ask, well, isn't this a war? Well, we don't know. We'll have to leave it to the experts. Who can really say? We'll do an investigation. We'll get back to you, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that contrast is part of what has really underscored just the incredible hypocrisy and double standards when it comes to Israel.
Absolutely. I really agree with that. And, I think racism is a huge part of that. I think, when the invasion of Ukraine started, I remember people commenting on social media that this was the first war that had been sort of live broadcast because of social media. And I remember at the time saying, Syria, we all had social media, that was like, to that, the Arab Spring, people had social media already, but the streaming of videos, the devastation that Bashar al-Assad was wreaking upon the people of Syria was all over the internet if someone was paying attention or cared to look.
Right.
And while certainly that does not undermine or take away from the suffering of Ukrainians at the hands of the Russian invasion, it was just really illustrative of where people are paying attention. And I do think for a mainstream American audience, a lot of that does have to do with race. And this also plays out in Gaza, where it's just so apparent that that Israeli lives, in the eyes of the U.S. foreign policy establishment and the mainstream media, are just seen as more valuable than Palestinian lives. And, the ongoing sort of victimhood competition is obviously a huge part of the problem here when thinking about the Israel-Palestine conflict. But but also just either like proportionality is part of international law. And so, I think this is part of, you continue to see these, just the horrifying numbers just keep stacking up and up, and they're just become kind of meaningless. But the point is to really show this is so outside the realm of what could be defensible under sort of any reasonable understanding of the word. And it really does, experts on this, I'm not saying this, but like experts have said, this is genocide.
Did your colleagues sort of recognize that in this situation, the analogous places would be like Ukraine and Palestine? That like it's kind of weird to be like pro-Ukrainian but also pro-Israel.
Totally.
Well,
Did they see that? Did people see that around you?
Oh yeah, people around me saw that, but then you still get that talking point coming from the White House. Which again just sort of gets back to the ongoing demonization of Palestinians, the dehumanization of Palestinians, the sort of equation of all Palestinians with Hamas. I mean, this is something you hear frequently in Israeli rhetoric that, unfortunately, that's a whole population of people who've been sort of trained to think of all Palestinians as terrorists.
Guys, this is just a tiny clip from a much, much longer discussion, and we have a State Department whistleblower here who tells all about the Gaza genocide. She resigned in protest. She's spilling all the tea on what's going on behind the scenes. You're not going to want to miss the rest of this. Sign up below on Substack for Crystal, Kyle, and friends. Appreciate it.